The crowd gathered early in the morning, filling the streets near the Grand Palace. Tourists, photographers, and locals stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the famous Royal Guard ceremony to begin. The sun was shining brightly, and a gentle breeze carried the sound of distant drumbeats. Excitement filled the air as people chatted, took pictures, and held their spots to get the best view. Among them was a man named Daniel Whitmore. He looked like an ordinary visitor, wearing a simple jacket and jeans. He carried a backpack, just like many others in the crowd. No one paid much attention to him. He didn't push to the front or act strangely. Instead, he stood calmly, watching everything with sharp eyes. His expression was serious, but not in a way that would make anyone suspicious. He blended in perfectly. As the time for the ceremony approached, the crowd grew even larger. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, flags waved in the wind, and the sound of chatter mixed with the clip-clop of horses in the distance. The royal guards, dressed in their bright red uniforms with tall black hats, were preparing for their march. The guards were known for their discipline. They never showed emotion, never reacted to the crowd, and always moved with perfect precision. People admired them, took pictures, and even tried to make them smile. But nothing ever broke their serious expressions. Daniel had seen this ceremony before. He knew every movement of the guards, every step of the march. But today was different. He wasn't just here to watch. He had a plan. A bold and shocking plan that would change everything. He reached into his backpack, his fingers brushing against the item he had carefully prepared. His heart pounded, but he remained outwardly calm. He had thought about this moment for weeks, maybe even months. He knew that as soon as he acted, there would be no turning back. Cameras were everywhere, and thousands of eyes would be watching him. One wrong move, and everything could go wrong. The sound of trumpets filled the air. The ceremony had begun. The guards started their slow, majestic march, their polished boots clicking against the pavement. The crowd fell silent, watching in admiration. It was a moment of pride and tradition, something that had been performed for centuries. Daniel took a deep breath. He knew that in just a few moments, he would do something that no one in the crowd expected, something that would leave people shocked, confused, and maybe even angry. But he wasn't doing this for attention. He wasn't doing this to cause harm. He had a reason that no one knew yet. He stepped forward slightly, still unnoticed by those around him. His fingers tightened around the object in his bag. The time was coming closer. He looked around, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some were smiling, some were holding up their phones, and some were simply lost in the beauty of the moment. They had no idea what was about to happen, and neither did they know that, by the end of the day, his actions would make headlines around the world. The ceremony was in full motion. The royal guards moved with perfect discipline, their boots striking the ground in unison. The sound echoed through the streets, mixing with the cheers and applause of the crowd. Cameras flashed, and excited whispers filled the air. Everyone was focused on the soldiers, admiring their sharp uniforms and flawless movements. Daniel remained still, his eyes locked onto the scene in front of him. His heartbeat had quickened, but his expression remained calm. He knew that once he took the next step, there would be no going back. The weight of his decision sat heavily on his shoulders, but he didn't hesitate. He had waited too long for this moment. The object in his backpack was within his reach. He had checked it over and over again before arriving here. Everything was prepared. The only thing left to do was act. He adjusted his position slightly, making sure he had enough space. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention too early. Timing was everything. The guards approached the center of the ceremonial area. The leader raised his arm, signaling the next part of the event. The soldiers halted in perfect synchronization. A deep silence fell over the crowd, as if everyone was holding their breath. This was the moment many had been waiting for, the highlight of the ceremony. Daniel took a slow step forward. His hands moved carefully, and he pulled out the item from his bag. It was a folded Royal Guard uniform, just like the ones the soldiers were wearing. The bright red fabric stood out against his dark jacket. A few people near him noticed, their eyes widening in confusion. But before anyone could react, he did something that no one expected. With steady hands, Daniel unfolded the uniform and held it up for everyone to see. The bright sunlight made the fabric shine. More people started noticing him, their murmurs growing louder. Some even pointed at him, wondering who he was and why he had the uniform. But before anyone could ask, he did the unthinkable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a lighter. Gasps spread through the crowd. People turned their heads, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. A few even took a step back. The realization of what was happening hit them like a wave. But before anyone could stop him, Daniel flicked the lighter and a small flame appeared. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The tiny fire danced in the wind, flickering against the fabric of the uniform. Then, in one swift motion, he touched the flame to the red cloth. The fabric caught fire instantly. Bright orange flames spread quickly, climbing up the uniform like hungry fingers. Smoke curled into the air, twisting and turning in the sunlight. The crowd erupted into chaos. Some people screamed, others gasped in disbelief. Cameras turned away from the guards and focused on Daniel instead. The peaceful ceremony had just turned into an unforgettable moment of shock. Guards and security officers reacted immediately. They rushed toward Daniel, their faces stern and alert. But he didn't run. He didn't struggle. He simply stood there, watching as the flames consumed the uniform. His expression was calm, his eyes steady. The fire burned brightly, but what shocked everyone the most was not just the flames. It was the message behind his actions. And soon, the whole world would want to know why he did it. The fire spread quickly, eating away at the red fabric as smoke rose into the sky. The bright orange flames danced in the air, capturing the attention of every person in the crowd. Gasps and shouts filled the atmosphere, and for a few moments, no one knew how to react. The peaceful ceremony had turned into a scene of chaos, and all eyes were now on Daniel. Guards moved swiftly. Their disciplined march was replaced with urgent steps as they rushed toward him. Security officers, who had been standing in the background, immediately sprang into action. The moment they reached him, they grabbed his arms firmly. "Put it out," someone from the crowd yelled. One of the guards quickly kicked at the burning uniform, trying to stop the fire from spreading. Another pulled out a small extinguisher from his belt, spraying white foam over the flames. Within seconds, the fire was out, but the damage was already done. The once pristine uniform was now nothing more than blackened ashes scattered across the ground. Daniel did not resist as the officers held him. His breathing was steady, his face calm. The crowd was still in shock, whispering among themselves. Some were angry, others confused. A few had their phones raised, recording everything. In this age of technology, his actions were already being shared online, spreading across social media like wildfire. One of the officers turned to him, his voice firm. "What do you think you're doing?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked around at the faces staring back at him. Some were filled with fear, others with curiosity. He knew that whatever he said next would be remembered, repeated, and analyzed by thousands, maybe even millions, of people. He took a deep breath and finally spoke. "I did what needed to be done." His words only added to the confusion. The officer tightened his grip. "What do you mean by that? Who are you?" Daniel looked directly into the officer's eyes. "You'll find out soon enough." More officers arrived, and within seconds, they began leading him away. The crowd parted as they moved through, with people still whispering and pointing. Some shouted questions at him, demanding answers, but Daniel remained silent. As he walked, he noticed something. Some people were not angry. Some were watching him with curiosity, even admiration. They didn't see him as a troublemaker. They saw him as someone with a message, someone who had done something bold. By the time Daniel was taken into a police van, the internet was already flooded with videos of what had happened. News stations picked up the story, and reporters scrambled to uncover the truth. Who was this man? Why had he burned the uniform? What was he trying to prove? As the van drove away, Daniel stared out of the window. He knew the world was watching. He knew the questions were coming. And soon, everyone would learn the real reason behind his actions. The police van moved through the busy streets, its sirens silent. Inside, Daniel sat with his hands cuffed in front of him. He stared out of the small window, watching as the city passed by. The crowd, the palace, and the burnt uniform were now behind him. But he knew this was only the beginning. His actions had started something bigger, something that could not be ignored. The officers sitting across from him studied him carefully. One of them, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, finally spoke. "Do you understand what you've done?" His voice was calm but firm. Daniel turned his head slowly and met the officer's eyes. "I understand it better than anyone," he replied. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Then explain it to me." Daniel remained silent for a moment. He wasn't ready to reveal everything just yet. He knew that the media was already trying to uncover his identity. He knew that people online were debating whether he was a criminal or a hero, but the truth would come out soon enough, on his terms. Instead of answering, he looked down at his hands. The smell of smoke still clung to his clothes, a reminder of what he had just done. He could still hear the gasps of the crowd, see the shocked faces of the guards. It had all happened so fast, but every detail was burned into his memory. The van pulled up to a police station, and the doors swung open. Officers guided him inside, past desks filled with paperwork and phones ringing nonstop. Other officers and staff glanced at him as he walked by, their faces filled with curiosity. He was taken to a small interrogation room. The walls were plain, the air cool. A single chair sat across from a table with a glass of water on it. Daniel sat down, resting his hands on his lap. A few minutes later, the same officer from the van entered and sat across from him. "You're all over the news," the officer said, placing a file on the table. "People want to know why you did it." Daniel smirked slightly. "I'm sure they do." The officer leaned forward. "You burned a Royal Guard uniform in front of hundreds of people. That's not something we see every day. Was it a protest, a statement, or just a reckless act?" Daniel's expression didn't change. He could feel the weight of the moment, but he was in no rush. He had spent months planning this, and he wasn't about to let impatience ruin it now. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I burned that uniform because of what it represents." The officer raised an eyebrow. "And what does it represent to you?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "A truth that has been hidden for too long." The officer studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" Daniel shook his head. "The truth isn't easy, but soon you'll see why it was necessary." The officer watched him in silence, realizing that whatever was coming next was bigger than just one man burning a uniform. Something deeper was hidden beneath his actions. And soon, the world would find out. Outside the police station, reporters gathered in large numbers, holding microphones and cameras. The news of the man who had burned a Royal Guard uniform had spread like wildfire. People on social media were debating whether he was a criminal or a man with a deeper message. Some were angry, calling his actions disrespectful. Others were curious, wondering what had pushed him to do something so bold. Inside the small interrogation room, Daniel remained calm. His hands were still cuffed, resting on the table in front of him. The officer sitting across from him tapped his fingers on the table, thinking carefully about what to ask next. "You said the uniform represents a truth that has been hidden," the officer said. "What truth?" Daniel met his gaze, his expression serious. He knew he couldn't stay silent forever. If he wanted the world to hear his message, he needed to start now. "That uniform belonged to a man named Edward Collins," Daniel said, "a former high-ranking Royal Guard." The officer frowned. He seemed to recognize the name but said nothing. Daniel continued. "Edward Collins was involved in something terrible. something that was covered up for years. The officer crossed his arms. And what does that have to do with you burning his uniform in public? Daniel took a deep breath. He had waited a long time to say these words. Edward Collins was responsible for ruining lives, including my family's. The room fell silent. The officer studied Daniel's face, looking for any sign of hesitation. But there was none. Go on, the officer finally said. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. 20 years ago, my father worked as a palace staff member. He was honest, hardworking, and loyal. But one day, he found out something he wasn't supposed to know. A secret involving Collins and a group of high-ranking officials. The officer leaned forward slightly, listening carefully. My father tried to expose the truth, Daniel continued. But before he could, he was accused of stealing from the palace. It was a lie. He was framed. The officer's face remained unreadable, but Daniel could tell he was processing everything. They arrested my father, destroyed his reputation, and forced him into silence, Daniel said. He lost his job, his dignity, and his place in society. Our family struggled, and no one believed us. Collins continued his career, untouched, while my father was left with nothing. The officer exhaled slowly. And you think burning his uniform was the way to reveal this? Daniel nodded. People needed to see it. They needed to ask questions. And now, they are. The officer was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. You understand that you've broken the law. There will be consequences. Daniel smiled slightly. I expected that. But if my actions make people dig deeper, if they make the truth come out, then it was worth it. Outside, the voices of reporters grew louder. The world was waiting for answers, and soon, the hidden truth behind the uniform would finally come to light. The officer sat in silence for a moment, tapping his fingers on the table as he processed Daniel's words. Outside the police station, the crowd of reporters had grown larger, their voices blending into a restless hum. Cameras flashed as news anchors spoke into microphones, eager to uncover the full story behind the man who had burned a Royal Guard uniform. Inside the interrogation room, Daniel remained calm. His hands were still cuffed, but his posture was steady. He had known from the beginning that he would end up here, facing these questions. But he had no regrets. The world was finally paying attention. The officer finally spoke. You say your father was framed by Edward Collins. Do you have proof? Daniel met his gaze, his eyes steady. I do. The officer raised an eyebrow. And where is it? Daniel took a deep breath. It's hidden. But soon, everyone will see it. The officer leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel. So let me get this straight. You believe that a high-ranking Royal Guard officer was part of a secret cover-up. You believe your father was wrongly accused. And now you've decided to bring this truth to light by burning the uniform in front of thousands of people. Daniel nodded. Exactly. The officer sighed. You must have known this would get you arrested. Daniel's lips curled into a small smile. Of course. That was part of the plan. The officer frowned. What do you mean? Daniel glanced toward the one-way mirror in the room, knowing that someone else, maybe multiple people, were watching the conversation. He had counted on that. He had counted on the fact that the more people listened, the harder it would be for them to ignore the truth. I needed people to notice, Daniel said. If I had simply told my story, no one would have cared. But now, the whole world is asking questions. The palace is under pressure. People are wondering why I did what I did. The officer rubbed his forehead, realizing that Daniel had planned this from the very beginning. You're playing a dangerous game. Daniel shrugged. I'm just revealing the truth. If that's dangerous, then maybe there's a reason why people don't want it to come out. The officer opened the file in front of him and flipped through the pages. We're looking into your past, Daniel. If what you're saying is true, we'll find out. Daniel leaned forward. Good, because when you start digging, you'll find more than you expected. The officer closed the file and stood up. We're keeping you here for now. There are procedures we have to follow. Daniel simply nodded. He knew this was just the beginning. The real storm hadn't even started yet. Outside, the news was spreading fast. People were digging into Edward Collins's past. Old files were being reviewed, and forgotten stories were resurfacing. Daniel's plan was working. He had set the fire. And now, the truth was starting to burn through the lies. Inside the police station, Daniel sat in his holding cell, his mind calm despite the situation. He had expected this. He had prepared for it. The real fight wasn't in this small, dimly lit room. It was outside, where the world was beginning to question the story that had been hidden for years. Outside, the media storm grew stronger. News channels debated the meaning behind Daniel's actions. Some called him reckless. Others called him brave. People on social media dug into old records, searching for any mention of Edward Collins and the scandal Daniel had hinted at. And then, something happened that changed everything. A retired palace staff member came forward. His name was Richard Evans, an elderly man who had worked in the royal palace for decades before quietly retiring. No one had ever paid much attention to him before, but now he had something to say. In an interview broadcasted live, he confirmed Daniel's claims. "I remember Daniel's father," Richard said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "He was a good man, honest, hardworking. And yes, I believe he was framed." The interview sent shockwaves through the country. People who had doubted Daniel now began to wonder if there was truth behind his words. Journalists rushed to find more witnesses, more records, more pieces of the puzzle. Back inside the police station, the officers had taken notice. The once dismissive attitude toward Daniel was shifting. The same officer who had interrogated him earlier returned to his cell, this time with a more serious expression. "You're making a lot of noise out there," the officer said as he stood by the door. Daniel looked up. "Good. That was the plan." The officer sighed. "Richard Evans just confirmed part of your story on live television." Daniel's expression didn't change. "And that's just the beginning." The officer studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "If this is really about justice, you need to give us more. If there's proof, if there are people who know the truth, we need to hear it." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You're asking the wrong person." The officer frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel's lips curled into a small smile. "I've already given the world enough to start looking. Now, it's up to them to find the rest." The officer exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "You really planned this from the start, didn't you?" Daniel nodded. "Every step." Outside, the pressure on the authorities grew stronger. People demanded answers. Protests began forming, not in anger, but in search of truth. More former staff members spoke up, their voices adding to the growing movement. The palace remained silent, but silence was no longer an option. The truth was unraveling, piece by piece. Daniel had set the fire. The police station was no longer just a place for questioning. It had become the center of a growing storm. Reporters stood outside, cameras flashing, their voices carrying through the air. More and more people were talking about Daniel, about his father, about the hidden truth that was finally being uncovered. Inside his cell, Daniel remained calm. He knew the final part of his plan was already in motion. He had spent months preparing for this moment, and now, it was all happening exactly as he had hoped. The officer who had been questioning him returned, his expression more serious than before. He stepped into the cell, arms crossed. "The palace has responded," the officer said. Daniel's eyes sharpened. "And?" The officer sighed. "They've announced an internal investigation. They say they're looking into Edward Collins's past actions." A small smile appeared on Daniel's face. "That means they're worried." The officer sat down on the bench across from him. "You started something big. People are demanding answers. The government is under pressure. And Collins, well, he's nowhere to be found." Daniel expected that. He knew Collins wouldn't come forward easily. The man had lived in the shadows for too long, hiding behind power and influence. But now, there was nowhere left to hide. At that moment, another officer entered the room, holding a phone in his hand. "You need to see this," he said, handing the phone to the first officer. Daniel watched as the officer's expression changed while reading the screen. His eyes widened slightly before he looked up at Daniel. "It's happening," the officer said. "A former palace official just came forward with documents. They prove your father was framed." Daniel felt a deep breath leave his chest. After all these years, the truth was finally coming out. His father's name would be cleared. The lies that had destroyed his family were now crumbling, and the world was watching it unfold. The officer exhaled and shook his head. "You're not just some reckless protester. You knew exactly what you were doing." Daniel nodded. "The truth needed a spark. I just gave it one." Hours later, the news was everywhere. The documents revealed details of how Collins and his associates had covered up their wrongdoings, framing innocent people to protect themselves. The palace, now under public scrutiny, had no choice but to take action. Investigations were launched, arrests were being considered, and Edward Collins, once untouchable, was now a wanted man. As Daniel sat in his cell, he heard the sound of the door unlocking. The officer stood there, looking at him with a strange mix of respect and disbelief. "You're free to go," the officer said. Daniel stood up slowly. "So, it's over?" The officer shook his head. "No, but it's finally beginning in the right way." Daniel stepped outside, feeling the cool air on his face. The crowd outside erupted in cheers and questions, cameras flashing, reporters shouting his name. But Daniel didn't stop to speak. He simply walked forward, knowing that the fire he had started would keep burning until justice was finally served.